welcome back to Aether Hour, everybody. I am your host, Conrad Franz, joined as always by Dmitry Kalyagan, here today to discuss what is probably one of the most powerful things we've released on the World War Now Substack. That is Dmitry's part one of his 4, maybe 5-part series on the ritual regicide of the Romanov royal martyrs, Tsar Nicholas II, and his family, and how the current understanding, even among some Orthodox circles, is actually not the full picture. It doesn't get into just how ritualistic, how satanic the murders of these saintly people were. So, Dmitry, how are you doing? Are you ready to get into this very serious subject? I'm very impressed that you are now the author of the most extensive exploration of this subject in the English language. How does it feel?
Well, it feels good on one hand to have the work out on paper rather than just having all these facts and details stuck in my head. I think first and foremost, because reading about all these sources, events, and facts over the years has essentially accumulated like an entire archive in my brain and also like on paper on my computer, just in my notes. And it was very important to sort of get it out in a cohesive fashion, which I found, somewhat difficult. It did take me about a month to write this, which I suppose is quite quick if you consider the word count, roughly it being close to 35 or 40 pages. But for those of you that have read it, and of course I encourage some of you to read it, although with the disclaimer that the article itself, despite the fact that it is about a saint and a saintly family, it is, I would say, maybe M-rated in terms of it's quite heavy material. Like if you've read a very heavy Life of a Saint, this is probably equivalent to that. Plus, with some criminalistic and very detailed exploration of the occult practices of the Bolsheviks, who were the murderers in this particular case. Because so it does read it a bit like a mix between a detective nonfiction work, a historical piece, as well as perhaps has elements of and being almost Lovecraftian in a way, because once you really get into it, you realize that the murder itself of the family, the details associated with it, were not secular in any capacity whatsoever. It was clearly a religious, a cult, and even occult, esoteric type of ritual that took place in the Ural Mountains in Yekaterinburg on the 17th of July in 1918. And for the first time, it was important to kind of get all of that out, especially in the context of the city, of the region, the Perm region, and explain why all of this was important, at least perhaps to the Bolsheviks, because we were given no motive. To this day, the FSB archives are closed on these particular questions. We don't know exactly who ordered the execution of the Romanovs. I call it execution, of course, in brackets, because it was completely unlawful. So it was a murder, but the Bolsheviks sometimes referred to it as an execution. And it is good to at least have some of these facts out so that future investigators and perhaps even prosecutors, perhaps when Russia becomes completely dominated by an orthodox ideology, this investigation can be reopened, and perhaps people with degrees in criminology, perhaps detectives and actual forensic workers could actually reopen this particular subject and even explore some of the facts which were brought up in the article itself and kind of move this idea forward. And naturally, this was only chapter 1 of a potential 3 or 4 chapters, which would mean that the entire work could span, but I would say above 120 pages. It's important to also ascertain that the first part is, despite it being somewhat dark, we didn't really get into the gritty details of the graffiti, the destruction of the bodies, the beheading of the Tsar. All of these will be brought up in future chapters, and we'll have entire, several pages dedicated to them, because there are so many various stories, memoir accounts, as well as facts that crop up decades, if not throughout the last century, which is all very important and needs to be covered. Because, again, history for some reason has really run by us Orthodox people, and we've kind of, over the last 100 years, kind of just stood on the sidelines and just watched things happen. And I mean, the best example of this would be the sudden discovery of the Romanov relics in the late 1980s and 90s, and then suddenly Boris Yeltsin and the mixed half Russian, half Jewish Nemtsov suddenly find these relics, and they present them to us and say, hey guys, we found the relics of your royal martyrs in the forest here, but they were located in a completely different spot to what all of the memoirs of the murderers actually mention. But these are the relics, definitely. Here are the bodies, here are the skulls. It's all there. There are no heads missing. The bodies weren't burnt or anything. Some of them were partially burnt. and all of them were shot, clearly shot in the Ipatiev basement. And it's a very easy, simple narrative which the Yeltsin government presented to us in the 1990s. But notice, this isn't this isn't a conspiracy that we're bringing up. This is something that even Patriarch Alexei II, Patriarch Kirill's predecessor, stated very clearly, that the Russian Church will not be recognizing these relics administratively. This is something that the people themselves need to essentially spiritually feel out. If relics were discovered in the ancient world, for example, the relics of a martyr, and they weren't labeled, the only way you would find out that they were actually legitimate relics would be through prayer, through miracle working, and just essentially through literally spiritual practice. So praxis would bring out the truth in this particular matter. And this kind of relates to these relics here. So, of course, the future chapters will touch on the actual status of the relics and how the ritual murder of the Romanovs actually relates to where their bodies were buried as well. So, in the end, it is an entire a look at not just the murder itself, Conrad, but the actual the future of the veneration of the Romanovs, I think, is important as well, because for all those visiting Yekaterinburg today, the cathedral, the Ascension Hill where the murder was taking place, the entire place is filled with churches, monasteries. It's a place of worship and veneration, which everybody can visit now and should visit, frankly, because it is a blessed place, blessed by the blood of the martyrs.
Everybody wanted to read the full article. The link is in the description on YouTube or on Substack, depending on where you're listening. Obviously, it's been posted on all of our social medias as well. Be sure to get behind the paywall to read the full nearly 20,000 words. It's really some invaluable information. Again, mostly never before seen or unveiled in the English language, you could say. But if you want to get behind the paywall and support us, it really helps us out. We've talked about, maybe if we get enough support and enough money, we'll do a true detective style drama series about, this and the investigation from the perspective of white army investigators or, from the more esoteric occult angle. So all of this is fascinating. We are awaiting at bated breath the future installments. But with all of that, Dmitry, I guess I'll just hop in and ask you some questions about the content itself here. You mentioned Yekaterinburg. Just the setting itself, not even the house, just even the town, is very important even in the grand occult narrative of this slaying. The article even mentions that the royal family was specifically moved here perhaps against what would have been the most military or politically feasible and advantageous place for them to be held. They moved them specifically to Yekaterinburg and the Ipatiev house for this reason. So if you could maybe break down some of the background there and how that ties into the ritualistic murder that you mentioned, grisly details forthcoming in these emerated, part 2s and part 3s, but maybe start us there and enlighten the people here who have not read the piece yet.
Of course. So part 1, naturally, talks very in depth about the context, and in the context, the historical geographic context, which is very important in this particular matter, is Yekaterinburg, the city located on the Ural mountain spine. So this is essentially similar to the Appalachians in the US. It's a spine, like a line of mountains going across Russia, cutting Europe and Asia in half. And so the southern spine of those mountains is actually located in the Perm region. Of course, on the tip of the Perm region in the east, so on the eastern side of the Urals, is where Yekaterinburg is located. Now, Yekaterinburg always struck me, as well as other researchers and even the initial investigators of the murder, the prosecutors who looked into it, as a bit of a strange location to move the most important family in Russia at the time. This is the family that held complete power, complete dominance, and who Kaiser Wilhelm and his military staff during World War I still referred to Nicholas II as a Tsar, regardless of the alleged abdication which took place. So the Germans knew the abdication was complete baloney. They knew that the Tsar still had complete power to sign any diplomatic documents, including, for example, the Tsar could, if the Germans took the Tsar hostage and they gave him room to perhaps sign a document splitting Russia up into many states, he had that authority. So this is what the Germans of World War I believed. So the Tsar was a valuable political piece in the hands of the Bolsheviks. The Bolsheviks knew that, but instead of transporting him into Moscow, St. Petersburg, of course, initially they took him to Tobolsk, which is just sort of on the outskirts of the European plateau, essentially, right on the entrance to the Urals. And interestingly enough, Tobolsk was actually the place where Rasputin was from. So the Tsars and the royal family's good friend, and Rasputin was essentially this Orthodox Christian layperson who was similar to, maybe not a spiritual advisor, but he would be somebody that the royal family spoke to very closely. So in fact, Tobolsk was an interesting place because, well, the Bolsheviks actually controlled it a lot firmer, and it was very much in their hands. And the article opens up with a query as to, well, do we move the royal family back into Moscow, or do we take them further east, far away, into a place which the Bolsheviks do control for now, but is also very close to the tumultuous front line of the Civil War? Because you have to remember the Civil War is raging at the time, or at least beginning to rage, and the Bolsheviks have almost zero control of Siberia. So why would they take the royal family into Siberia unless there was some other purpose for it, right? And as we discover, as we read through the article, we look into the facts, there was a very dark purpose, and that purpose was to commit a ritual of some sort. And that ritual, of course, as the future articles will discover, was quite a bloody one, and one which involved very different people, one which was Talmudic in its nature. But what kind of brings us into it? This article, this talks about how the Yekaterinburg city itself was very much associated with the Romanov family in a very interesting way. So the Romanovs in the past have visited Yekaterinburg several times. The most famous visit was by Alexander I, just before he, of course, went off to become Fyodor Kuzmich in 1825 on his sacred journey to become an Orthodox elder, essentially, in Siberia. And now, of course, he's sainted. But in 1822 and 1823, he visited Yekaterinburg. And he stayed for a few nights on this wonderful hill in the center of the city called Ascension Hill, Voznesenskaya Gorka. But Voznesensky Hill translates directly to Ascension Hill, which is why this is what we'll call it. It's just simply easier in English. It relates to the Ascension feast day in the Orthodox Church. So Ascension Hill is located right in the center of Yekaterinburg. You can actually bring up Google Maps, zoom into Yekaterinburg, and find Ascension Hill right at its center. So it was quite a luxurious point of real estate. And in fact, some people even stated that, geographically speaking, Ascension Hill was the highest point on the entire southern Urals as well. So this mountain, this hill, like this Mount Tabor style location, right? So, and I think the biblical analogies are very important here, because the Bolsheviks, despite the fact that they were atheistic, allegedly, they very much knew their New Testament and Old Testament. If you've read Trotsky in his memoirs, he constantly quotes the New Testament. Like he knew it off by heart. It's very, very strange how these people actually actively involve themselves in scripture, in the reading of the Torah. These people knew their religious texts very well. And this is the Bolshevik leaders, that is. So the royal family was moved to Yekaterinburg in April of 1918, so several months before their murder in July. And they were moved, and they arrived actually right on the cusp of the 1st of May, which was, of course, the famous Bolshevik Labor Day. The city was, at the time, not, of course, today Yekaterinburg is quite big, hundreds of thousands of people, but back then it was maybe roughly 70, 80,000 people strong. So today, similar to maybe a large suburb somewhere in New York or something. It wasn't like a giant city, and it was known for primarily its mining practices. A lot of gemstones were mined in the mountains surrounding it. They were very deep mines, I would say, and even some of the rituals, the mining practices, if you can imagine, before electricity were extremely dangerous, right? Because you couldn't really have lights down in these caves and other places. So there was already real superstitious pagan practices associated in these areas relating to going and digging up in these mines and tunnels, digging up things. Essentially, men who would go out and sort of mine metal, copper, gold, would subject themselves to huge risks. And so what they would do superstitiously in a pagan fashion was they would sacrifice people before the venture itself. So essentially, like the Russian proverb goes, for a work to be firm, blood needs to be flowing under it. And in that capacity, we even see a newspaper outlet, and this isn't mentioned in the article, so this is essentially, I'm providing you extra content here. In 1905, 1906, there was a mysterious murder. A young girl got her throat cut near the entrance to a mine, a newly built mine. And so essentially people would be sacrificed on occasion by a very superstitious, I would say non-Christian, and there was a lot of non-Christian sectarian cultist elements as well in these particular Siberian cities, unfortunately, which the local clergy fought with. Don't get me wrong, like Yekaterinburg was full of churches and monasteries. I think you had a total of 19 churches at the time, and I believe 2 or 3 monasteries. And one synagogue. So you can kind of tell the religious affiliation of the majority of people was the Orthodox Christianity, but there were a lot of superstitions, a lot of various other toxic cults going around. The biggest cults, of course, were Dukhobori and Khlisty. And you'd question, well, why did these little cults matter? Well, it's because this is the atmosphere in which the Bolsheviks actually committed the crime, and these particular cults could have perhaps pointed towards Ascension Hill as the perfect location for this particular event to take place. Now, just going back to that particular sacrifice, so people would be murdered, similar to how the ancient Aztecs at the beginning of a certain season would murder people on top of their pyramids in Central and South America. So would the Bolsheviks as well murder the royal family, essentially at the commencement of their reign in 1918. Right before the reign would take place, they would, of course, slay the king, behead him and his entire family so that their reign could be successful in that way. And this is essentially how the local superstitious people of the Urals committed their various ritualistic murders as well. That's a very interesting analogy. But how did the Bolsheviks actually find out about all this local symbolism? And then, of course, related to Ascension Hill itself, which was a strange place, right? It's quite dark because Ascension Hill and that particular spot where the Pachev house was located, it used to be a cemetery. Well, Yekaterinburg was founded in the 1700s, but Ascension Hill itself was discovered quite early because obviously you can see it from a distance. It's quite high up. And so the primary governor of the region, Tatishev, actually founded and placed his mansion right on top of the hill. But after that, of course, once he moved back to St. Petersburg and Moscow, he left the mansion essentially abandoned. So eventually the mansion was demolished and a church was built in its place. Now, next to the mansion, right on the spot of the Apachev house, there was this mysterious grave site, a cemetery. A lot of historians actually mention it. So even mainstream Russian historians mention that the Apachev house was standing on an old cemetery of some sort. But none of them mention the fact that, and I found this curious, reading local historians from the Urals and local, even modern day, like explorers, people who live in the city and who know the city inside and out, and they read these old archived sources. They're stating that the cemetery itself wasn't a Christian one, or at least wasn't your typical Christian cemetery, which had an abundance of crosses, because during the USSR, the Soviet Union, they actually committed an excavation of the site. They found a lot of bodies buried, but just below the Apachev house and just outside of it. And they discovered that none of the bodies had any crosses on them. And this is unusual because when Orthodox Christians are buried, typically there are baptismal crosses on their necks. Unless, of course, those crosses were made out of wood, which is a practice among some old believers, that they take off your silver or gold cross before after you pass away, and they put a new sort of small wooden cross around your neck. And that is the only exception that would make this somewhat reasonable, right? But this particular hill had people buried without crosses. And of course, the location of the hill and of the roads on crossroads is also a little bit suspicious, given the fact that, well, crossroads is typically where European peoples, and even in ancient times, pre-Christian times, people would bury witches, sorcerers, and those who have...
Thank you so much for listening to this free preview of this huge Aether Hour episode. If you want to read the article that we are talking about and listen to the full uncensored episode where we bring you some more information that isn't even mentioned in the article, so there's reason to read and to listen, be sure to check out the link below, worldwarnow.substack.com, worldwarnow.co. It really helps us out to get behind the paywall. If we get enough subscribers and get enough monetary support through our Substack paywall and all of that, we will hopefully be able to bring you this book in hardcover in the future. So if you want to see more content like that and a whole bunch of other things, be sure to support us. It really helps us out. But thank you so much for listening, and God bless.